Well, Bush 41 has gotten extremely favorable obituaries. Almost everybody is saying he was a good president. They seem to be contrasting him to another Republican president.
Yes, I think if we make a list of people who would benefit by comparison with Donald Trump, we wouldn't have time to go through it on this podcast or on the 20,000 subsequent podcasts. So to say it's a low bar to clear is an insult to low bars.
Well, the standard approach is to start with the good things that Bush did and then mention that not everything was good. Here we'd like to do it the other way around. What would you say is the worst thing that George Bush 41 did as president?
Well, a number of things. Certainly encouraging the wars in Central America, the consequences of which we experience this very day with migrant caravans out of Central America. Certainly his mode of getting elected, which was a scabrous way of playing the race card and the Willie Horton ad. And Bush always seemed to sort of divorce himself from that. That was mere politics, didn't count. The ends justify the means. But the means became really the heart and soul of the Republican Party. The Willie Horton ads, Michael Dukakis let this guy out, the revolving door of African-American, presumably criminals coming out of jail. This was already becoming a stock and trade of the modern Republican Party. It is now virtually the sum and substance of the modern Republican Party. But that was how Bush vilified Michael Dukakis, who, let us remember, actually led in the polls in 1988 going into Labor Day, and then came the vilification.
Let me point to two other things that I think are the worst things he's done. First was nominating Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court. Every time there's a Republican majority, we can thank George Bush for his contributions of the man who's probably the most right-wing of all Supreme Court justices today. And I would say the second worst thing that Bush did was his last act as president, which was pardoning many of the Iran-Contra crew in order to block investigation of his own role in breaking the law. That points the way for Donald Trump to follow the example of George H.W. Bush by pardoning the people who might testify against him. Could you review what this is about?
Yes, in December of 92, after he had been defeated the previous month by Bill Clinton for re-election, just less than a month before he himself was to leave office, Bush gave full pardons to 6 former Reagan administration officials, former Defense Secretary Cap Weinberger, President Assistant Elliott Abrams, his National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, all of whom had been indicted and or convicted of criminal charges by the independent prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, who'd been called in to be the independent prosecutor of the Iran-Contra scandal.
I think we just need to remind people what the Iran-Contra scandal was about. Reagan, as president, had armed the Contras, a right-wing army that was trying to overthrow the left-wing government of Nicaragua. And then Congress passed a law banning all American aid to the Contras. The Reagan people nevertheless continued to provide arms to the Contras with money they got from selling arms to the Iranians, who, by the way, had been holding Americans hostage. The news of this secret deal got out, and that's why the special prosecutor was appointed to prosecute the people who had broken the law prohibiting aid to the Contras.
Right, and of course Reagan himself said he didn't know anything about it, and if, that might have stretched plausibility, but it was certainly characterologically plausible for Reagan. Not so for Bush. There were notes that Cap Weinberger had taken in which mentioned that Bush was involved in this, that he'd been in meetings about this, and that Lawrence Walsh learned that Bush's private diary might have had some material on this as well. But by pardoning Weinberger, as well as the other people who had been convicted, Bush essentially got himself an out.
So what Bush did here, just to summarize, Bush pardoned Weinberger, preventing a trial in which evidence of his own involvement in the scheme to break the law would have come out. And after that, the special prosecutor Lawrence Walsh declared, quote, the Iran-Contra cover-up, which has continued for more than 6 years, has now been completed, close quote, as a result of Bush pardoning the people who could have testified against him, revealing his own role in this. The parallels to Trump actually are a lot closer than a lot of people realize, I think.
Sure. I mean, there's no question that Manafort and maybe Mr. Cohen and various other folks who are sort of twisting in the wind at the moment, like General Flynn, his brief, short-lived national security advisor, all these folks and more probably have material on Trump and the connections of his son and what he knew about Russian subversion of the election. And, the one way to get rid of this, well, there are a couple ways. I mean, he could fire Mueller and see what the consequences of that could be, probably impeachment by the incoming Democratic House, or he could pardon Manafort and some other folks and see if he can skate by on that. So I think it really is a pretty plausible parallel to what George H.W. did in the waning days of his presidency.
One last thing that George Bush did that really was good, when he ran in 1980 against Reagan in the Republican primaries, he called Reaganomics voodoo economics. That was a great thing.
It was, and whoever was his speechwriter, or if he came up with it himself, all power to that person.
Explain what voodoo economics was.
Reagan was advocating supply-side economics, that you could hugely cut taxes and you wouldn't run a deficit because the economy would become so massively productive that more taxes would flow in just as a result of that. That, of course, was proven false during the Reagan presidency and every subsequent Republican presidency, Bush's son's presidency, and the Trump presidency, and their tax cut of a year ago. You lower taxes on the rich, and the deficit simply grows, and there's no evidence that it really particularly boosts the economy. So, voodoo indeed.
Even though Bush told the truth about Reaganomics, he nevertheless got the Republican vice presidential nomination. How did that happen?
Well, Reagan represented at that point a faction of the party, not the entire party. And Bush was, in some ways, at that point in 1980, the most plausible representative of, the last gasp of more old-line republicanism. Plus, Bush agreed to go along with whatever Reagan said. That's the precondition for being vice president. So it was both the last gasp and perhaps more accurately the surrender of old-line center-right republicanism when Bush agreed to accept Reagan's offer.